going to turn to this passage that we read in John chapter 4. Jesus heals the official's son. But before we do that, I do want to talk about this question about Jesus healing today. Does Jesus heal today? Because it's a really important question in lots of ways. When you're sick, people pray. We have people in this congregation who are very sick, and you pray for them. And there are different understandings that Christians have about healing. So my first encounter with this to some degree was a teenager when I had a friend who was in a wheelchair and he had muscular dystrophy, and there was an evangelist who actually said to him, the reason you're in that wheelchair is because you don't have enough faith to get out of it. Which was pretty well the cruelest thing I've ever heard anyone say. It was unbelievable. I mean, we were furious. It was really awful for that to happen. On the other hand, I've heard people say, well, there's no point, God doesn't heal anything. So for example, look at something, there's a lot of talk, about President Trump being almost killed, and people were talking about, well, it was miraculous, God intervened. And then someone rightly said, well, what about the fireman who was killed? Why didn't God intervene with that man? And so people those are genuine questions. And also in terms of illness and sickness and being healed. I had been seriously ill in hospital, and when I got out and recovered, I phoned up the surgeon who played a great part in my recovery. He was a Muslim, and his wife answered the phone, and I said, I'd like to ask you and Mr. Shimmy, because you have to call all surgeons Mr., not doctor for some reason. I would like you to ask him to come to a Thanksgiving service, that they were having at the church, that my life had been spared. And she said, oh, that's lovely. I mean, why do you want him to come? I said, well, he's the man who saved my life. And she said, oh, no, that's not what he says. So what does he say? He says, God saved your life. He didn't know what to do. And he regards you as a miracle. And I just went, oh, dash it. I said, I've had my theology corrected by a Muslim. But he was right. I mean, I genuinely believe that. I believe we had a time at that point where I was really ill, and Annabelle will tell you more about it than I, because I don't remember. I remember very, very little of it. I was in and out of a coma. But at one point, I was particularly ill. I got pneumonia of the lung on top of everything else I had. But the clerk of our General Assembly had and in the Free Church we don't do this, had sent a message around all the churches, whatever you're doing on Sunday, stop if you can at 12 o'clock and pray for David. And you can put it down to coincidence, but from that day I began to get better. It's an awful coincidence, in some ways. But at the same time, there was another minister who was seriously ill, and he was expected to recover, and he died. And the first time I met his widow, when you're talking about that, well, okay, is it because you didn't have enough faith? Is it, what do you do that people do say, well, we have to go and lay hands on, or you anoint with oil? First charge I went to is a small Highland charge in Scotland, and I remember going and see one of the elders and saying to him, see that bit in James about anointing with oil? Why don't we do that? And he said, have a look, David. And I looked at him and he said, what's up there? I said, that's a bottle of olive oil. He said, why do you think it's out of reach? Because we don't use it for cooking, we use that. I said, what, you anoint people with? Yes, he said, of course we do. I said, wow, I didn't realize this was a Presbyterian. Presbyterians did that. But it was, they were right, they prayed. They met and they prayed for healing with people. So the question of whether Jesus heals today the basic answer is, yes, he can, and sometimes he does. Often, it's through normal means. I regard the Lord providing us with doctors and nurses and everything else as a really gracious provision. But when people mean healing, what they're really talking about is something that is supernatural, beyond nature, a direct divine intervention. And yes, he can do that. But we don't have the right to demand it. It doesn't always happen. And if you get sick, even if you're Lazarus and you're raised from the dead, you're going to die again. So we don't have, we would never say, come to Jesus and you won't be sick. But equally, we would pray for people who are ill. And I've not seen a huge amount, but I've seen things that I've absolutely no doubt at all God intervened.